This is my fourth time at RVAsec. I love this conference. It's phenomenal. I'm a big fan of the multiple tracks, and so here I am once again, and I really appreciate it. I'm Desmond Holden on Twitter, so you can heckle me there as well. So getting started. Every good presentation, as you know, starts with a Sun Tzu quote. I'm messing with you guys. That'd be a jerk move. I do want to use some quotes, though I normally don't, but I read a book a while ago, and this was actually brought up yesterday in one of yesterday's talks. How many of you have read The Phoenix Project? Fantastic. I'm a big fan of this. As you, anybody that's read it or even heard of it probably knows, it's about the DevOps revolution, and there's actually a lot of discussion on LinkedIn, Twitter, et cetera, about DevSecOps. And a lot of the things covered in this book, I think, are very relevant to SecOps, and I think a similar revolution needs to happen there. And so I'll cover some of that. But we'll start with a quote that was specifically about the CISO in the book. Jimmy's problem with the auditors shows that he can't distinguish what work matters to the business versus what doesn't. And I think as we all know, and we've heard it from a lot of the talks this week, about the business security relationship. Matter of fact, Andy kicked off things yesterday with that very topic, and we've heard a lot about that. Obviously, we've made huge headway in terms of the industry and how we relate with the business, but that's still one of the primary challenges. And continuing with Andy's keynote yesterday, a lot of times I mention the CISOs being in the Fall Guy scenario, and I really like mentioning the Fall Guy mainly because I'm a Gen Xer that loved that show in the early 80s. But since everyone knows Game of Thrones, we'll call the CISOs the Game of Dethrones here. There's a lot of different challenges, and a lot of things I'm going to say are not, one size certainly does not fit all. Obviously, every business is different, every structure is different, every CISO is different, et cetera. So I think you all are aware of that. So I'm not casting any wide dispersions, but I am basically highlighting what I have both personally seen and what we have seen as a company at Pharos with the hundreds of CISOs that we have talked to, sold to, worked with over the years, et cetera. A lot of different scenarios here. Part of this comes down to reporting structure, and you'll see the analysts cover reporting structure a lot. And over the years, they've been talking about how it's improving drastically. Majority of CISOs used to report into the CIO. Now things are changing, especially in a post-breach scenario. That's really where I think you see most of the reporting structure changes occur. I will say most of the CISOs I see still report into the CIO, which can work. Anything can work if the business wants it to work and supports it. However, I will say personal experience has highlighted that a CISO reporting into the CIO is often set up as a fall guy. And part of the reason for that is that the CISO ends up getting caught up in trying to protect the ocean of IT assets and IT projects rather than what matters to the business. And so when I say the business, I mean at the executive level and at the board level, right? So take, for instance, Warren Buffett, since we all know that name, and he's, I'm sure, on multiple boards. Does the CIO and Warren Buffett agree on what is important to be protected? And I think that's something that's incredibly important for a CISO to be asking. Otherwise, who are you trying to please? Your boss or the board member? And so that's a possible conflict. The other issue is just being able to defend the security program itself, whether that's spend, whether that is the risk analysis occurs, whether that is the security and protection that the program is capable of. Many CISOs, when they are questioned, can't defend what they're doing. And so that sets them often as the fall guy. Other issue, of course, is just being challenged by other aspects of the business, whether that's audit, compliance, legal, et cetera. So there's a lot of pitfalls. Charles Tango, CISO at Atria earlier, was talking about his talk next week, or next year he was going to propose was why not to be a CISO. I thought that was brilliant. I hear that from quite a few CISOs, so it certainly is an issue. So we wanted to look at this. I think we've all heard for many years that CISOs typically have an 18 to 24-month turnover period. And so we actually went on LinkedIn and pulled some numbers about executive positions that have been in the role for less than 9 or 12 months. And you can see CISOs at the top here compared to CMOs, CFOs, and CEOs. And this made me think actually of RSA this year. I'm sure many of us were there, but there was a big conversation / complaint, if you will, coming out of the event. While the security industry itself seems to be doing quite well, the conference gets bigger every year, there's tons of money being spent and made, but are we actually making security better? Or as an industry, are we just becoming more profitable and better at raising money and building companies, et cetera, et cetera? And so I think a lot of the CISOs were asking themselves, is the industry actually helping us improve our programs? And so obviously it seems that we're used to the CISO turning over. Why do we all say that and then ask ourselves, why is that occurring? And it's to the point, I'm sure many of you, especially in sales, know the company Discover. I'm not picking on them, they're just doing their job, but as you can see in this example, they're so familiar with this problem that they actually arm salespeople and companies with how to sell when that CISO position turns over. Obviously, if you have turnover, that's a potential sales opportunity both for the new CISO, the old CISO, the folks that replace the CISO, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's to the point where not only do we all know this, but the industry is selling into it, right? They're taking advantage of it. And so, obviously that's just good capitalism, but at the same time, as an industry, I think we should be asking ourselves, why the hell is this position turning over so frequently, and what can we do about it? And that's both, of course, on the CISOs and on us, I think, as an industry. The CISO is not the only fall guy, though. I think we're all familiar, obviously, with Equifax. We all end up repeating the same breaches over and over again. But we've got well over half a dozen CEOs that have now become the fall guy in breach scenarios. Matter of fact, today it was announced that Equifax is the first breach that has actually caused the credit rating of the company to go down. Well, which is funny since Equifax is a credit-related company. But it's also interesting, when the CEO was testifying in front of Congress, he was asked, what was the most important thing to Equifax? From a business crown jewel standpoint, let's say. Was it our data that they had? Or was it the fact that they sold a service that when all of our data was leaked, they would protect us? And so that's a really good question to ask yourself. One, as someone that, as we all had to deal with that breach, but what are you protecting? What were they protecting? Were they protecting our data as a crown jewel, or were they protecting their business, their product, their solution as a crown jewel? I won't make assumptions, but it's a very interesting question. All right, so why are the CISOs in this position? In other words, what have we as an industry armed them with? What are they leveraging? What are they using? Famous book, if you've never heard of it, Eating Soup with a Knife. That's kind of what this feels like. And let's start out with, and this is the part where I poo-poo the industry, so start with GRC, because I really like picking on this. This is actually not from me, this is from Gartner. It might be the first time in my career that I'm quoting Gartner, actually. John Wheeler, one of the analysts at Gartner, recently posted a blog, I think it was just maybe a month, 6 weeks ago, on 4 reasons why GRC is a useless term. Not relevant for senior leadership. Certainly a guy like Warren Buffett gives 2 craps about your GRC. Negative connotation to many risk management practitioners. And I think the most important one, because many things in this industry have made big promises and end up kind of being pigeonholed into one thing. And I think the G and the R aren't nearly as influential or evident as the C here. So compliance ended up being a big aspect of GRC. And as a market term, it is increasingly meaningless. Now, which is funny, when an analyst says that, they're the ones that are helping it become meaningless. But I can tell you I've talked to a lot of analysts, and there's a lot of agreement in this space. Matter of fact, a former Gartner analyst, old buddy Richard Steinen, was recently doing a talk where he said, GRC is nothing more than documenting that you've done your job. And whether we're talking about GRC, or we're talking about frameworks, or we're talking about breach avoidance products, or any other multitude of aspects, that is what a lot of this ends up being. The CISO is, of course, trying to save their bacon and doesn't want to be the fall guy, and so they're doing the best they can. And so this puts them in a position of leveraging, of course, what is out there. And a lot of that just has to do with due diligence. How many times have you heard, I can tell you how many times I've been asked, what are our competitors doing? What is the level of due diligence of the rest of the industry? And let's match that, because then at least that's defendable, to the CEO and board. The problem is it's not. It's increasingly not defendable, and that's what I want to touch on. Charles Tango, again, downstairs today in the 101 session, did a talk about how risk is not security. And so I want to add on to that and say not only is risk not security, but security is not protection. So in this example, we have our hero. Obviously, he looks like he's in some risk, or at risk. And perhaps he does have some security. Maybe he's got a big knife on him. Maybe he even has a single-shot gun. Maybe he's got a sword and can swashbuckle for a moment. But he's obviously outnumbered. In other words, the attacker sophistication that he is up against is beyond his capability to defend. So he's at risk. He has a level of security, but the ability for him to protect himself is beyond the security's reach. And so we use these terms all the time, but they are not interchangeable. They do not mean the same thing. And again, picking on the industry here, Barry this morning mentioned this. The thing that you can, of course, control is what you have at risk, right? The assets, the important things to the business. You can control, how exposed they are. But you cannot predict whether you're going to be attacked. And I find it hilarious that there are literally products and solutions out there that try and do that same thing. Monte Carlo simulations, AI, whatever fluff you want to throw at them, but that is not necessarily the name of the game. And again, CISOs are trying to cover themselves and say, oh, well, we're going to prevent a breach. Well, again, you've got to ask yourself, does Warren Buffett care about a breach, or does he care about a breach that impacts the business? And again, two different things. And this brings up, classic debate, chaos theory, black swan. You can measure risk all day long. You can make predictions. You can have your scorecard. You can do all that stuff. It makes you feel better, great. If you can defend yourself with it, great. But you can't predict whether something is going to occur or not. Whether there's a history, a lack of history, we do know that things just happen. Matter of fact, it happened big with, of course, APT1. And since this term hasn't been abused too much lately in front of me, I'll abuse it and talk about APT. But this was a fantastic blog, a company called Countercept. And the blog is about, of course, the targets of APT1 and what happened. But the real meat, the whole takeaway for the blog is really the last two paragraphs. And it was all about these companies not understanding what would happen if their crown jewels, if the things that mattered to the business were stolen. And again, this goes into the risk equations, right? What we ask ourselves is, well, what is an asset worth? In these scenarios, not only did these companies need to be asking themselves what an asset was worth, but a new variable was introduced in the fact that not only is it worth, what is it worth to our company and our business and our customers, but what is it worth to, in this case, China? And so obviously the impact was huge. In the tenure of a single CEO, these companies essentially went under in two cases, declared bankruptcy, and in the case of ATI, trading at less than half of what it was pre-attack. So again, you can't necessarily predict these things. You really have to start protecting yourself from the ground up. You don't start at these guys' levels and work your way down. What you do need to understand, though, and what your board members and your CEO need to understand, is what the impact will be, right? If anything does occur, what is the impact? This was discussed heavily today by both Barry and Charles. It's not about, everybody says, well, the breach is going to occur, the breach is going to occur. Well, if we keep saying that, then yeah, why are we working so hard on breach avoidance? Understand what the impact will be and work backwards from the impact. Another old mantra in security I want to touch on is, does ROI exist? If you Google security ROI, I guarantee you there's 3 blogs that pop up. They're a decade or more old. They basically argue that business ROI does not exist in security. Sure. But there is a very clear definition I think we can and should be using in this industry for ROI. And CISOs specifically need to be talking about it in this manner so that they can both defend their budget and win additional budget, headcount, whatever is needed for the program to be more successful. Of course, in the CISO's view, things look like this. Everything's DEF CON and cool. The problem is many times this is just not defense in depth, but expense in depth. You've bought a bunch of stuff, you've got a bunch of logs, you've got a bunch of things happening. Whether you can manage it all or not, of course, is a question. You could outsource it, but the issue is, are the things that you've invested in actually providing you what you were expecting? And that's a question that's very rarely asked. Matter of fact, it did come up recently, if any of you are familiar with the Vendor CISO podcast. It was a question that came up, and funny enough, it was a vendor asking it, I believe. And the CISO said, no, we don't look at it after the fact, and probably most CISOs don't. But you have to think about it this way. Every single time you buy a solution, every time you buy a technology, every time you invest in a new control set, you just went into a negative ROI. Because we all know that, of course, people are the magic of security. The people, process, and technology are what bring that all together. But as an industry, we always talk about and focus on the technology. The people and the process are going to be leveraging that technology and actually creating the ROI, right? So if you buy stuff and throw it in the closet, that's negative ROI. If you buy stuff and you don't tune it correctly, let's say you have amazing response capability, but you don't have detection capability. These are all negative ROI situations. And so those need to be addressed and looked at. Why? Because from the CFO standpoint, they just, or the CEO, right? There's more and more money funneled into security, and yet the business can't, in most cases, say what they've gotten for it. Now, interestingly enough, we actually understand ROI very, very well. And I hate to use insurance analogies, but think about your home insurance, your auto insurance, right? You purchase it, you get this much protection for this level of investment. It is the most simple idea in the world. So I believe this is the way we should be talking about ROI in the industry. It is, I want a level of protection for a level of investment. And that's the way a CISO should be talking about it with the business, CEO, board, or otherwise. So if you want to increase your protection, you spend more. Now, of course, the devil's in the details there. But I think certainly this is the level of ROI and the conversation the business would like to be able to have with security. I think if we were also doing this correctly and could talk about it correctly, the egregious pricing of a cyber insurance would also go down as well, and there probably wouldn't be so many issues with it potentially not being paid out. But that is for the future. There's been a big theme, again, going back to LinkedIn. People have been talking about going back to the basics. And a lot of this has to do with really our, let's call it disgust or wariness with a lot of the marketing buzzwords, whether that's AI, machine learning, blockchain, automation is a huge one lately. And it's great, right? Obviously, if you can make the people and the operations more efficient, that's a huge win. But we also all understand a lot of that is just marketing fluff. The problem I have as a veteran of the industry with back to the basics is it makes me feel like we're rewinding the clock. Every time I hear it, I almost feel like, what are we saying? Going back to 2006 and back to that defense in depth, which has ended up leading to expense in depth. And so if we're really getting back to the basics, we should be talking about strategy. And again, quote right here from the Phoenix Project, you get what you design for. What you're building is the bill of materials for all the work that you do in security operations. But instead of a list of parts and subassemblies like molding, screws, and casters, you're cataloging all the prerequisites of what you need before you can complete the work. meaning you should have a strategy. And I'm sure if you ask a CISO, they're going to say, of course I have a strategy. Great, what is it? Well, we're an ISO-based shop, or we focus on NIST. That's not a strategy, that's a framework. What you've explained to me when you say, oh, we're based on ISO, we're based on NIST, you're saying you have a list of parts. Have we really learned anything new from frameworks over the last few years? Have we not known what controls were needed for the majority of security for at least over a decade? Is there anything seriously novel about a framework with checkboxes that said, oh, have you done this? Do you have this? Have you installed it? Have you deployed it? That is a list of parts. That is not a strategy. A strategy, of course, includes more than technology. The people, the process, the business. Does your marketing or your legal understand what is going to occur and how they're going to be impacted and involved in a breach? That is a part of your strategy. Going to reference another analyst here. That's how you know I'm getting old. I'm really changing my style here. This one's from 2013, if I remember. Matter of fact, the founders of Duo often quote this exact same image. This was done by Rick Holden. I've thanked him endlessly on Twitter. Rick, thanks again. This is a brilliant blog. This is the targeted attack hierarchy of needs. And this is when everybody was going APT crazy back in 13. And you can see at the top is detection and response, prevention, all the things that we tend to talk about, right? All the things that are technology focused, all the things that are on those parts list of ISO and NIST. But at the base of this is an actual security strategy. And again, if you question, if you challenge a CISO strategy, often that is the part that is lacking. Fundamentally, the next part right there is a dedication to recruiting and retaining staff. And I mention that because we're going to come back to it here in a moment. But if you don't have staff, obviously you don't have a program. Whether it's a program, whether it's a company, whether it's anything, right? The people are what matters. Not to mention, and I'm going to come back to this here in a few, but the part that probably costs you the most is your people. So that strategy becomes incredibly important because you need to be able to track to it. I don't know if any of you have heard of this. This is the Eisenhower decision matrix. This is preached endlessly and talked about a ton in startups, and I think it actually works incredibly well with security programs as well, especially with some of the programs that I have personally sat in. I was involved with a client one time where they spent 2 weeks, and this was years, a number of years ago, but they spent 2 weeks in a war room with all the people that mattered in the security program, chasing what they saw was a serious. This fly is killing me, guys. They were chasing this piece of spyware that they thought was a serious breach. And we came in and ended up highlighting that it was actually just a piece of spyware. And they were so excited to be in the war room, they were feeling so special and urgent that they nodded their head and said, okay, well that's good. We figured that out, on to the next one. They just stayed in that war room, went on to the next one. You've got to ask yourself, is something urgent? Is it not urgent? Is it important? And you've got to ask yourself, are all these urgent things actually getting in the way of the long-term strategic vision? The reason why this is important is twofold, I think. One, the efficiency of how you're using your resources. So how are you using your people and your process? Two, the CISO has got to be in a position where they have some breathing room from the business, right? So you need a strategy so that it can be explained and defended over a period of time. Let's take, for instance, let's say college football coach. We're in the South. How often college football coaches turn over? Pretty often, right? But you don't come in and say, oh, well, we're going to win the championship the first year, right? That's not they would like it if that happened. But no one has a serious expectation that the new coach is going to win the championship first year, right? There is a 3 to 5 year plan on how that's going to occur. The CISO should be in the exact same position. Otherwise, what happens? Well, they end up turning over within 2 years because they can't track to a strategy and plan. And once it's challenged, or once there's a breach, and the breach was not properly explained, or in other words, going back to what I said earlier, the impact wasn't understood by the business, out you go. So being able to gauge how you're spending your time, how you're spending your effort, you can always find something to do. Everyone's incredibly busy. But being busy isn't actually making anything better. It potentially is making things worse. It can lead to poor morale. What if you're busy on something that truly doesn't matter to the business? That doesn't feel good when you find that out. So what is missing? What does CISOs need to actually improve at this? What do I think, as an industry, we need to be helping out with? One is that people problem. So we hear this all the time as well. And it's a fun debate, of course, to always question where these things actually started and originated, but I won't go into that. I will say that if we truly are facing a skills shortage, do we think we're unique in this? Matter of fact, let me pick on the industry further. Let me pull up Peter Griffin here and talk about what really grinds my gears. How many times in this industry have you heard that security is a journey, not a destination? I would say that is utter and complete bullshit. You may, it is certainly a journey, but you should probably know where you're going. The destination should probably be understood. Does any other aspect of the business get to use that excuse? Does R&D? Does sales? Does marketing? Well, we're going to build the product, but we're not going to QA it. We're going to build the leads, but we're not going to actually talk to any of them. Or we're going to talk to the prospects. We're not going to close the deals. I mean, on and on and on, right? No other aspect of the business gets to use that excuse. And yet here we are talking about, well, security is a journey. It is, but it should be a journey to a destination. Certainly the destination can change. We understand that business changes. Fine, but the business does need to know where the destination is, and obviously as that changes, that can be communicated. I think if the skills shortage is serious, we're obviously not going to start cloning each other, at least anytime soon. So we should probably be looking on what makes us more efficient. And if I was actually going to talk about where I thought AI and machine learning would actually be useful, that efficiency would actually be it. I don't need more red blinking lights from AI. I need AI actually helping me be better. That would be my argument. Again, this is not unique to us. We should be looking at other industries. How many times have you heard, oh, security is like accounting before the calculator? So another great example in the Phoenix Project. A big theme of the book is the Toyota way. They talk a lot about manufacturing. Manufacturing is a great example to look at. Another quote from the book here, improving daily work is even more important than doing daily work. Your efficiency needs to be as high as possible. And so what they have is total productive maintenance, and they've got some KPIs that are key to that. And of course, you can Google this and look into it. It's an example. It's not a direct correlation. Point is, being able to take needless work out of the system is more important than being able to put more work into the system. And in security, that's generally not the way we think. And so right now, we're really interested in, well, how good are we doing? We've got these silly scorecards, and again, if they work for you, fantastic. But just because you have a metric doesn't actually mean it's the metric you should be chasing or tracking. Or does it matter? To whom does it matter? Obviously, as a control owner, you're very interested. Let's say you're the control owner of incident response. You're very interested in what the dwell time is, right? But again, does Warren Buffett care about the dwell time? It's a metric. It's not a KPI for a board member. So the point is here, just because you have a metric doesn't mean you actually report on it, right? So if you're a CISO and you're reporting on vulnerabilities patched and malware blocked, good luck keeping that job. You need to come up with KPIs that matter to the business. Now again, obviously KPIs are going to change at a various level. As a control owner, you want to understand the metrics related to your control. As the CISO, you do want to track those metrics and KPIs in terms of how your people, process, and technology are performing, right? What is your SecOps actually doing every day, every week, every month? But does the CISO literally take those metrics and then present those to the CEO and the board and say, oh yeah, we do stuff, we work real hard? Again, a matter of fact, there's a great, and if you get on YouTube and look for CISO presentations to the board, I've only ever seen one. It was done by John Pescatori, also way back when Gartner. Really good, totally worth watching, and they go through literal examples of this with CISOs, talking about how to and what to be presenting at the board level. For anyone here in the practitioner space, I would absolutely suggest you watch it. I've been super impressed with RVAsec because so many of the talks or the people here are technical, but I've never seen, especially at a conference, so many people being relating their technical duties and jobs back to the business. So we're obviously getting better at this. Another industry, and maybe not the most timely one given the 737 issues, guys, so forgive me on that. This is, I believe, a Boeing system called ICAST. And again, you can look this up on Wikipedia. But think of another industry that has an immense amount of responsibility and with very few people actually being the ones that are responsible, right? Commercial airlines are a great example of this, right? There's only 2 pilots, and then there's the folks in the rest of the plane managing things. But if you go back 50, 75 years, there used to be 5 pilots, and then there were 3 pilots, and now we're down to 2. And of course now, again, 737, right? There's increased automation. And it's a great example, and some really good analogies and corollaries to security there, and that was actually also covered on one of the CISO series podcasts. But my point here is that you really, if we're hoping to get more efficient, and if we're hoping to speak better to the business, we need to have things that they not only understand, but things that give us the most pertinent information that we need at any given time. Right? In other words, if the CISO is challenged by whomever, audit, legal, CEO, CFO, is the CISO in a position where they can defend an answer very quickly? Do they have what they need at their fingertips? Or are they going to have to go spend a month in spreadsheets and blah, 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 and it's going to take forever? Or they're going to have to call in the big 4, and they're going to come in and tell them the time on their watch and hand a report, and it's subjective, and you all have seen this before. I like the idea of ICAST because, again, it gives the most pertinent information to the pilot when they need it. You can see some examples here. Blue, typical type of logging stuff. Yellow, and then you can see over on the right side, engine oil pressure. No bueno. But the dashboard aspect of this industry, I think we've done very poorly. And I say that because I literally walked around the RSA floor, and I challenge you to do the same if you're there next year, or even at Black Hat this year, or anything else, where people have demonstrations set up. And walk around and look at the products, and you tell me if these products look different from each other. I was blown away, if any of you are JavaScript developers. To me, it looks like every single product in InfoSec was built on Chart.js. I mean, they all look alike. So the question is, are they actually providing what we need? How many of you have seen Moneyball, read the book or seen the movie? You're probably thinking to yourself, it should be think differently, not think different, but beggars can't be choosers when you're stealing memes off the internet. Point is here, this was a phenomenal book, phenomenal movie, and it is all about the way in which the Oakland A's challenged baseball back in 2002, 2003. They had a third of the budget of the New York Yankees. And so they knew they couldn't keep up from a spend standpoint, so they looked at doing more with analytics. And they were essentially looking for different KPIs to measure ball players on. And they did an amazing job. They made it to the playoffs, and everybody copied them. Some people would argue that the Red Sox ended up winning 2 years later because they did copy that model. It's up to you guys to decide. But point here is that deeper analytics, the qualitative, quantitative aspects of what we're doing every day need to be questioned because I'm sure there is a lot of work going on. Is it the correct work? Is it the most influential, the highest ROI work? It's time to start questioning what we're doing, not what we're buying. To this point, and kind of sticking with my silly Pirates of the Caribbean theme, and going back really to the Phoenix Project, everything has to be working in unison. So on a ship, what are we actually doing? We're moving cargo, right? So that's what the ship is protecting. all week long, right, we've heard risk, 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 risk. Risk is your rudder. Risk is fantastic, but I want you to think about risk like this. How much money, how much investment of your overall security budget is actually going into risk? And I would wager to say it's probably minor compared to the cost of the ship and all of the aspects of that ship, the sales. Think of these as your security controls, right? So your SecOps is your people, your technology, your vendor partners. All of these things are where your money's wrapped up in. It's actually a very small budget. In most cases, I would wager that the risk piece actually comes in. The most costly part of the security program is likely your crew, right? So if the crew on top of the ship doesn't know actually how to run the sails and leverage the rudder, they're not going to get the ship where it needs to be with that precious cargo. So this is the way we need to start looking at SecOps. This is the way we need to look at a security program. It's not about any one piece being amazing, right? If you have great crypto, whoopity-doo. But how many pen test presentations have you seen where they just walk in the front door with a pizza box or a yellow vest and a ladder? I mean, we've been seeing those for 20 years, right? So things have to be balanced. A couple more quotes I'll leave you with here from the Phoenix Project. Remember, outcomes are what matter, not the process, not controls, or for that matter, what you complete. Right? So from Warren Buffett's level, all he's caring about is what is the outcome? What is the result? What are you giving me for my investment? So if I hand you $7 million, or whatever your security budget is, what level of protection will I gain? The goal is to increase the throughput of the entire system, not just increase the number of tasks being done. Again, question your metrics, create KPIs that actually matter. So you can be the master of your ship. All right, moving towards the CISO of 2025. There's a couple aspects here. One, a lot of people were questioning whether the CISO position will even exist. We saw this at Facebook, right? No CISO at Facebook. Make any of us feel better? We're probably still on Facebook though, right? That's the risk analysis we all do. Our founder and CTO went down to the local pub and had some chicken wings, ended up being terribly sick. He came back a few weeks later, he's like, hey man, let's go get some wings. And I'm like, wow, I'm really surprised you want to get wings again. He's like, well, you know, wings go well with beer. I did the risk analysis. Well, you know, I like the wings and beer, let's go get it. Right? We do that all the time, very quickly, very fast. Obviously, I think for the CISO to actually not only exist, but to continue moving forward, if you're doing it right, you know, we hear this all the time, reactive versus proactive, but I mean, it really happens. Security is very reactive. The big thing is, where is the risk falling? And we heard this several times today, both from Barry and Charles. The risk needs to be at the business level, not the individual level. That's how we change that CISO from being that revolving door position. I've mentioned KPIs several times. I think obviously you've got to have something to report on, and that something needs to be actually useful at the executive level. Again, if you're reporting on patches, you know, vulns patched and malware blocked, no one, I'd be surprised if they care. I will be very interested if any of you want to argue this with me, though. Definitely open to that. And the big part is the CISO actually becoming a consistent and credible position. This is the goal, I think, for all of us, for the CISO and for anyone that is working for them, working with them, and on the vendor side, you know, that are selling to them and wanting and looking to be, you know, true partners. If the CISO doesn't elevate as an executive position and as an executive role, they will be nothing but subscribers to budget. That position will continue to turn over at a very high rate, and they will continue to lose respect at the executive and board levels. And you will see more Facebooks not have them. You will see companies put that role under others, right? Chief risk officers, general counsel. You know, there's lots of people that might lobby to take over the InfoSec role. And of course, we know today there's still many CIOs and companies that are working without CISOs. So I think these are the things that have to change in order for that role to exist and really be productive and I think useful 5 years from now. I wanted to leave you all with a few resources, really just things that inspired me for this presentation. Again, this is something that I think we all have to work together on. The CISOs need our help, and obviously, if all of us are going to be successful, we need them to be successful. So a few things I already mentioned. The Forrester Targeted Attack Hierarchy of Needs, quite good. There's another blog that Rick did years ago called The Trouble with Tribbles, and that's where he coined the expense in depth, which I also mentioned. A lot of these ideas are covered on our blog, FerosSecurity/blog. Obviously, I've mentioned the Phoenix Project, but another book I would really say, if you haven't read it, take a look. How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk. If you want an overflow of metrics and KPIs, this is a great place to start. That's it for me. If there's questions, I'll certainly take them. Yes, sir.
Can you give an example of 3 meaningful KPIs?
I will tell you, if I'm a board member, what I want to know is, what are we protecting, how much are we spending, and at what level can you protect it at? I'll tell you, I actually asked Charles Tango downstairs, what does he present to the board? And because we were talking about security versus risk versus protection. And he said, at that level, at the executive level, it is absolutely about risk, because they understand it. So I think risk, even though I poked fun at it, risk is the place to start. Executives understand risk. So that's definitely the place. The obvious thing from a metric KPI standpoint is how that's going to change over time, right? So it's not about knowing where you're at. Knowing where you're at just means they fire you and get someone else to tell them the same thing, and if they don't like the answer, a revolving door, right? So I think showing a path forward, that college football analogy, you've got to have a plan, you've got to have a business case, and you've got to have a business plan. And then you've got to be able to show that you can execute to that. So I think that's a big aspect of it. Was that too fluffy? Was that politician? Absolutely. Yeah, and thank you. Checks in the mail, that's exactly what we do at Feros. So I could obviously go in depth, but I'm not going to do a vendor pitch. But certainly we can talk afterward if you like. Great question, thank you. Any other questions? Best question is, what are they serving outside? Shall we? Thank you very much.